Okay, good morning. I have a number of presentations. I like to run this as interactively as possible. What I mean by a la carte is that, as you see, we have a program and a menu, but many of the case studies may be some of the areas you either know about or you might not be interested in, or there might be some areas you might be very interested in. Certainly, I think, we haven't said very much about it, but the new law that's being discussed in Parliament and will be in operation on 1st of April, I think is worthy of quite a lot of discussion, and how that's going to be applied. I was very fortunate enough in the last couple of days to be in Delhi, and I managed to do a lot of talking and listening mainly, and reading, and discussing with people who were working, who were involved in creating the new law, but also people who have been thinking about how to apply it. First of all, well, who am I? My name's Michael. So my own personal journey has been kind of fun. Let me see, I was born in England a long time ago. And one thing I'm very proud of in England was that I received free education. I received free milk. I received free school dinners. They were awful, but I received them. Free transport. And then when I went to university, I got a grant. I got free transport, although I used to hitchhike up the M1. So when people say to me about excessive government expenditure and so on, I always say this. I said I wouldn't be here without all that. I come from a fairly modest background. My parents and so on. Basically, my father fought in the war, the Second World War, and their parents and so on were Welsh miners and restaurant owners and so on in Ireland and so on. And I was the first one in my family to go to university. So I've always felt that I wanted to pay that debt back. So that's why I seem to have gravitated into CSR and working on social issues for quite a lot in my life, which has been very rewarding, as everyone knows. Somehow, if you give rather than take, it's somehow more rewarding. And isn't this very, very strange that we have so many people with billions of dollars trying to get more? There's a very interesting book that's just come out called How Much? Let me see, when I was born in the south of England, I wanted to get as far away as the south of England as I could, so I went north. So I went to Yorkshire to study at the University of Sheffield. Now, of course, I mean, it was 150 miles from my hometown to the university in the north of the country. You know, about the distance from one side of Mumbai to the other. But it seemed an awful long way when I was a lad. I was a kid. I did pure mathematics at university. After that, I wanted to go to travel, so I went to Canada. I did a graduate degree in mathematical statistics. But actually, they had the biggest computer in the world at that time, so I played with the computer. And I got intrigued with computers. And at one point, I could program every computer on the planet. Just shows that that long ago there weren't that many computers. And when Bill Gates was asked by IBM to develop an operating system for the PC computer, which had just been kind of invented, why didn't they ask me? Because I could have done that. I could have written the operating system for a PC. And then I learned a lot about that. I thought about that a lot. There's two things that didn't happen. First of all, my father was not working for IBM, as Bill Gates' father was. But secondly, not only did Bill Gates create an operating system, but he built an empire. He was a very able person to develop an empire business. So I'm not sure that I've been able to do that. But it's very instructive that in life, your network, there are opportunities everywhere, but you have to be in the right place at the right time. And you can only really get there by working and following what interests you. And that's kind of what I did. And I must say it's been fun. I don't regret any of it. I went back to London and became a school teacher. And then I still got my sister, and she said, "No, Michael, you really ought to get a job." So at that time, it was a time of interviews with companies, and they used to pay you to go to the interview. They would actually pay quite generous allowances to go to the interview. So I got good at interviews. I'm serious. I lived on that. I lived on interviews for about 6 months, and then my sister said, "Why don't you get a proper job?" So I said, "Okay." And I said, "The only company I'm not going to work for is IBM, because I'd worked for them as a graduate student, and nobody from my university had ever worked for IBM." And that was a bit radical in those days. So I thought,
you weren't done?
Yeah, I was actually, but they didn't pay me. I'll tell you a story about that too.
Interns never get paid, actually.
I think interns should be paid, actually. A little bit, but we'll discuss that as well. See, a lot of issues are now, as I'm talking, a lot of issues are being raised. But let me. Today, as it happens, I'm an advisor to the European Football Association on corporate social responsibility. And you might have seen the Respect program. And every year, I meet everybody working with social responsibility in the football industry. It's absolutely fantastic, from players to referees to coaches to managers to sponsors and so on. And our next meeting is in Lisbon in a few months' time, just before the final of the European Cup. So I have a very good life, and it continues. But let me go back a little bit to working as a teacher, and then I moved to work for a big international telecommunications company in London. I hated working in London, but I loved the work. So I went to, decided to go to a nice place, and I went to Brighton, University of Sussex, where I got a job as a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, which you may have heard of. And I started doing my computer programming and statistical work. And one day, a very interesting chap came along, a guy called Jürgen Randers. Probably might have heard of him. You might have heard of something he worked on called Limits to Growth and the Club of Rome, which is now mid-70s. And these chaps come from MIT. They had a computer model of the world. And there was a huge seminar, there were hundreds of people at the seminar, sitting at the back. And Jürgen Randers was sitting in the front, at the front. And showing a computer model. You know what a computer model is, like a simulation model?
Schematic diagram.
Sort of. What you can actually simulate things, like simulate economies and simulate the environment and so on. Yeah, I do. I'm not going to really get into models. So I started life off by building models, and it was actually this experience that got me into it. So Limits to Growth was 4 or 5 people from MIT, so it was a good pedigree, saying that if the world continues this way with rapid population growth and increasing in pollution and so on, then the world's going to end about 2050. He's doing estimations of linear programming models in eastern Bihar. You know, I was working in that region. I thought, wow, I gotta get into that. That's incredible. So I did. at the end of it, they announced that they had an advanced seminar in Germany run by NATO for 6 weeks, and the audience could apply. So I did. I'd never been out of my country. I thought, this is great. So I went to Hanover in Germany and learned all the techniques and how to do all this modeling about how the world's going to come to an end and all the rest of it. That was absolutely marvelous. And then I went back to England, and I was a very young kid, I was in early 20s. And I became the UK most knowledgeable person on this technique, which had hit all the front pages of the newspapers and everything. So I had Andy Worrell say my 5 seconds of fame. I think I actually said 15 minutes, but it was 5 seconds of fame. And then I got invited by the UN to build a world employment model. So I left Sussex. You know the biggest thing about leaving Sussex University? The biggest thing I regretted was it was the last time I ever played cricket. I love playing cricket. And that was you know, we make decisions in life and all sorts of decisions, right? And in the end, it's kind of quite small things. It was quite a big thing. I haven't played a game of cricket since. But then I went to the United Nations in Geneva to build this world employment model. So I went to an organization called the International Labour Organization, which you may have heard of.
Sorry?
It's actually International Labour Organization, which is kind of the UN organization responsible for employment. And I worked for something called the World Employment Program. And I was there for 13 years. But I got a bit bored with the bureaucracy in the UN. So I kept on taking leave of absences. So the first leave of absence, I went to Colombia in South America. I should just preface that by saying when I went to the Institute of Development Studies, just about everybody was working on India. And I thought at the time, remember I was a very young kid, but I think that this statement's still true, that I'd never met an Indian who wasn't smarter than me. So I figured that, what can I do to help India? I'll go somewhere else. So I went to South America, and I spent a lot of my life working in South America. And I still work there, actually, as it happens. Since then, I've been very fortunate in having worked in over 120 countries around the world. And of course, every country is different, every bit of the country is different, people are different. But people are wonderful, generally. That's what I found out. There are a lot of people I don't like in a lot of countries, I'm sure, for all sorts of reasons. Don't let's go into that. I like to be positive, generally. What amazes me, and some of you here worked in very poor villages, is what's amazing is that the poorer somebody is, the more generous they are. Isn't that amazing? I haven't quite understood that, but I'm quite impressed. I'm going to tell a story a little bit later about a project I'm working on with very, very poor people. So I went to Colombia, but the ILO said to me, why are you going to Colombia? I said, well, I got $1 million from the Dutch government to do models around the world. So I decided that I'd go to Colombia. And they said, well, you signed this paper sending you to Colombia, but it's your name. They said, yeah, I'm the boss. I said, well, you can't send yourself. So I okay, just a minute. So I went upstairs and found my best friend. And I said, who I'd hired to come to the ILO, and I said to him, Rolf, one thing, you've just got to accept one thing. And if you say yes, I won't tell you what the one thing is. I'll make you the boss. Oh, yeah. So I made him the boss, and he sent me to Colombia. And we're still good friends even today, 30, 40 years later. In Colombia was another nice story in that. I'm going to get into how this got me into CSR. Football probably saved my life in Colombia. Because when I went to Colombia, I went to a university. And the first worry, of course, because Colombia had this reputation of violence, mainly because of drugs. La violencia, went on for 50 years before I'd arrived there. And I was kind of worried that they'd take me to the CIA. So I asked some of the professors, I said, could you find out what they're thinking? You know, so I'd better make a hasty retreat. And so on, nothing happened. I'm still alive, but I thought this is good. So 3 or 4 weeks later, I said to the other professor, well, what's happening on this? And during that time, I started playing football for their team, and I was their star. They said, Michael, you're a football player, you can't possibly be CIA. Of course, a contradiction in a sense. But so that, well, about 15 years later, moving on the clock, at that time in Colombia, there was a group called the M19, which was a guerrilla group. And 15 years later, they actually turned themselves into a political party. And I remember it was late 90s. I was in Colombia with the head of the Human Development Report. You know that report? Run by the UNDP. I used to work on that. And the head of the Human Development Report made a meeting with the Minister of Health. It so happened that the M19 had been given one position in government. It was Minister of Health. So because of security, we went to the top floor. And everybody had AK-47s except me. Hello. So I sat opposite with Mabubal Haq, who was the head of the Human Development Report of the team. So our team was on one side, the other team was the Minister of Health with his helpers. And I was translating because I spoke Spanish or interpreting. And I looked at the minister and he looked at me. Miguelito! He was my inside right in the football team. Football saved my life. Let me move on a little bit further. After the ILO, I took a lot of leave of absences. I was actually, for 2 years, chief economist at the Dutch Antilles. And then towards the end, I wrote a book for The Economist on Tunisia. So I followed with great interest the Arab Spring and all the rest of it. And then, at that time, I worked in 3 main countries, Colombia, Malaysia, and Tunisia. And they said to me, how come you work in those 3 countries? They all end in A. They've got beautiful beaches and beautiful women. I said, I have no idea. I left the ILO and I set up my company, MHC International. And I continued to work with the UN as an advisor on the UN Human Development Report.
Yep.
And one day, about mid-90s, I left the meeting trying to convince the UN to do a report on CSR. But they weren't interested. And I thought, my God, on development, the UN is not going to ever get anywhere. I love the UN and the people in it and so on. It's a very small organization. You know the budget of the UN is actually less than the New York Health Department. They had a mayor, Giuliani, in New York once who was determined to get rid of the UN. In the end, he turned out okay, but he wanted to get rid of the UN. And his aides pointed out to him, if you do that, New York will collapse, because first of all, the airport depends on it, and most of the hotels on the east depend on it, and so on. So he changed his mind on that issue. But as I was walking away from the UN, I was wondering about development. And I thought, well, I've worked with the UN, I've worked with universities, I've worked with governments, and I've worked with the private sector. Let me have a look at what the private sector is doing on development. And so I changed, and that led to a book I wrote on CSR and international development, and my interest in corporate social responsibility. And I thought at that time that I would only work on it for about a year. and then I'll carry on with other work. But I'm still working on it. One thing I thought about CSR was that it was obvious. I mean, what's wrong with treating your stakeholders in a pleasant way, treating your customers with respect, looking after your employees? So it struck me that's kind of obvious. What do I need to say more? But it's taken me down a path, and this is going to lead to a body of knowledge that I'm going to share with you over the next couple of days. So let me think, is anything else on the basis of that? Oh yeah, at the same time I got my PhD in labour economics from the University of Geneva. So I'm also a labour economist, so I was interested in the labour aspects of CSR. I still am. I still work on those issues, but I still work on employment strategy, and I work in a number of countries, from Azerbaijan to Mexico to, I don't know, I was in Trinidad not so long ago, all sorts of things. Smaller countries when I think about it. When I think of India with nearly 1.3 billion people, the mind boggles, actually. And as I said, last couple of days I was in a conference on CSR in Delhi. And as I said there, I'm very, very kind of excited to be in India because you're the largest democracy in the world. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. Especially Harshit is going to talk a little bit about the political economy of CSR. So it's going to be fascinating. But you'll criticize, I'm sure, as you should, your government. I'm sure the word bureaucracy comes up like there's no tomorrow, and we've all experienced that. But at least you can criticize it. If you lived in North Korea, you couldn't say a damn thing. So even if I said that in North Korea, I'd be spirited out of it. So I think that you can treasure that. Sometimes you forget. You're living in a democracy, you can say more or less what you like. Well, you do not everything, as you know. But more or less, and generally the things that you're prevented from saying lead to violence. And generally people think and should stamp on that. And my other kind of big concern in the world is that the